you can't just be driven by your fear of negative reputational consequences. Because if you were, you'd stay the hell away from Bitcoin as well. A system that can move millions of dollars across borders is going to have some uses that are very unsavory. It's also going to, I think, make the world freer, better, and be a buttress for human dignity and prosperity.
Welcome to the What Bitcoin Did podcast.
Hi there, how are you all? Welcome to the What Bitcoin Did podcast, where you get to hear from the best minds in Bitcoin and crypto. I'm your host, Peter McCormack, and this week I have an interview with Peter Van Valkenburgh from Coin Center. But first, I have a message from my show sponsors, and please check them out. These are the people that help make this show happen. So first up, let's talk about Deribit again. As I mentioned, I'm really excited to have these on board as a sponsor. When I was out in Vegas, a lot of the traders were telling me that they've moved to their platform. So why are they creating such a buzz? Well, firstly, they've never been hacked. Their platform is built for stability, so they have no system overload crashes like you see with other trading platforms when the prices go crazy, and they can easily support high-frequency trading. They also support instant withdrawals and have never once had a socialized loss, so that's pretty cool, right? So if you want to check them out, head over to deribits.com where you can get a 10% discount for your first 6 months. That is DERIBITS.com, and make sure you use the S. You can go to deribit.com, which is the main platform, but if you want the discount, head over to deribits.com with an S. Just a note, Deribit is not available to US citizens. Next up, I want to talk about my regular sponsor, BlockFi. I'm actually off to New York to meet these guys today to find out a bit more about what they do. So did you know you could take out a loan backed by your cryptocurrency? Whether you're looking to finance a business or even buy a house, BlockFi helps investors use their Bitcoin, Ether and Litecoin without selling it. Backed by Mike Novogratz, BlockFi is the leading crypto to USD lender in the US, servicing over 45 states with interest rates as low as 7.9%. And they have a special offer for the listeners of my podcast. If you sign up at blockfi.com/whatbitcoindid, you can get $25 in free crypto added to customer collateral loans of under $10,000, or $50 in free crypto added to customer collateral loans of over $10,000, and applying takes less than 2 minutes. Okay, so on to my interview with Peter Van Valkenburgh from Coin Center, and I have to say a big thanks to Niraj for helping me get this set up. I've wanted to meet Peter for a while, actually. I thought his Senate testimony alongside Nurul Rabini was very, very good. If you haven't seen that, I've included it in the show notes. Coin Center are really important. They do some really important work working with policymakers to try and keep these public permissionless blockchains open and free for anyone to build on and innovate with. They are very, very important, and they rely on donations and support from the public. As you know, I had Jesse Powell from Kraken on the podcast last week. They've been a big supporter. They themselves donated $2 million to the work they do, and it's worth going through their website and reading the material they write. It's really, really useful. So it's great to have Peter on board. I'm really grateful to him for coming on the show. If you've got any questions about it, please feel free to email me. You can get hold of me on hello@whatbitcoindid.com. Sorry if I sound really tired. It's 5:30 in the morning and I'm in Washington, and I'm trying to get this out before I get a flight over to New York, so apologies for that. If you want to support the show, you always know there's a whole bunch of things you can do. If you want to find that out, you just head over to my website, www.whatbitcoindid.com. There's a support section that tells you what you can do. Anyway, I'll let you get on with the interview. Hope you enjoy it. As I said, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Thank you for inviting me over here. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks, Peter. Thanks for having me on your show.
Yeah, it's good. Nice to finally meet you, especially after watching your Senate testimony with Nurul, which I will ask you about. But I want to learn about Coin Center today. So it would be good if you could tell me firstly your background, how you came to be part of Coin Center, and why it is so important for you.
Sure. So the two things that are important to doing this job are law and technology, because Coin Center is a nonprofit advocacy organization that's focused on cryptocurrency policy. And so my background, from a technology standpoint, I had sort of a lost 3 or 4 years where I tried to be an actor in New York City. And most of my friends paid the bills by waiting tables and tending bar. And I did that for a little, but then figured out that I could teach myself web design and build them all websites and charge for that. So that's kind of how I paid the bills while I was an actor. And it got me into front-end web coding, and it got me deeper into the internet, which I always loved. After deciding that that was not a fruitful life path, you're really just trying to get people to take your resume, and you're doing auditions all the time, almost every one of which you will do horrible at or be rejected from. I decided, okay, I should go get a real degree. So I went down to Northern Virginia, where I'd grown up. This was in New York at the time. But I moved back down to Northern Virginia, and I went to George Mason, got a degree in economics, undergrad. And that's where I got connected, actually, with the group of folks that included Jerry Brito, who's our executive director. He was at the Mercatus Center teaching teaching also a law class there. And then I went to law school back up in New York City at NYU, and I focused on internet policy. That was what I was interested in because of my sort of self-taught tech background and my strong feelings about digital copyright policy and how we shouldn't be, villainizing people who share 5 seconds of a song on YouTube and slamming them with statutory damages and things like that we had a lot of lawsuits back in the late 90s, early 2000s about. It was around the time of the Snowden revelation, so I got into digital privacy law. So I focused on those topics in law school. I was pretty sure I didn't want to work at a big law firm because even if you're working on internet law, you're going to be sort of defending the big copyright holders or things like that. Not that, there's anything wrong with that. We need people to do that work. So I figured I would just go down to DC and work on advocacy. And I was lucky enough to get a fellowship from Google. They have this fantastic thing that they do every summer called a Google Policy Fellowship. They pay you to work with different civil liberties organizations in DC and in other places. So I did that, got a job at a cool think tank called Tech Freedom that was focused on copyright and telecommunications law. And then Jerry, who, as I said, I kind of knew from previous circles at George Mason, found me and said, "Hey, Peter, do you want to be the director of research at a cryptocurrency think tank?" Actually, he said Bitcoin think tank at the time, of course, because it was most of all that was going on. This was back in 2013, 2014. And I looked at him and I laughed. And I said, "That's crazy. Are you doing this?" And I said, "Sure. Where do I sign up? That's the best opportunity ever." And the reason why I felt like it was the right choice, I've obviously never been that risk averse, at least given the crowd of lawyers who are typically very risk averse. But also, I think that internet policy has sort of hit a standstill in many regards. Net neutrality was something new, and the large debate over that, although it was a difficult issue and one that really, I didn't actually have a strong opinion one way or the other because I'm mistrustful of the FCC sometimes, but also mistrustful of the big corporate telecoms, don't know how to find a good way forward. So I never liked working on that issue. But copyright and privacy law, this was after the Snowden revelations. The USA Freedom Act was moving. We were trying to fix these government surveillance policies, but it was very slow going and hard, dealing with the weight of decades of precedent about the Fourth Amendment and things like that was sort of set in stone. Copyright was sort of reasonably, had hit kind of a reasonable compromise. So the Digital Millennium Copyright Act had sort of done some bad things with respect to making it illegal to traffic in materials that allow you to break DRM, the anti-circumvention preventions, but it was a compromise bill. You also got the safe harbor, the notice and takedown safe harbor, which is the thing that allows a blog to post, have user comments on it, and the user comments, if they violate copyright, won't get the blog maintainer in trouble. Similar also with YouTube. YouTube won't get in trouble as long as they take down stuff, even if their users uploaded copyright infringing data. So I'm probably giving you too many details, but those legal issues were sort of at a standstill, I think, in 2013 and 14 when I was looking to do something in DC on internet policy. And Bitcoin was a complete green field or blue sky or open questions yet to be determined. Unfortunately, when I was in law school, I thought I'll just do internet policy. So I took a lot of copyright classes and privacy law classes, and I avoided the finance classes like the plague. Maybe it was just I was in New York, and I didn't want to be too hooked up with the biz dev people and things like that. But it was a bit trial by fire. When we started Coin Center in 2014, we immediately filed a comment with the New York Department of Financial Services in the bit license proceeding. That was already going at that point. And I think we helped bring about some meaningful improvements, but we still were very unsatisfied with where it came out. We started working on money transmission licensing. And then gradually we saw that we would need to really focus on anti-money laundering and securities law. So I sort of learned by doing with respect to those areas of law. And I think we've come up with really good policy as far as how we can still enforce those laws, but carve out as much freedom to innovate as possible, accepting that those laws are going to apply anyway, and figuring out how they apply to these novel new things where there weren't good answers before because there really was something new.
Right. And how do you feel that the crypto industry, its current state of regulations and oversight by regulatory bodies. How do you feel that compares to, say, the early days of the internet? Is it very similar?
It's similar and different. The similarities are disruption, the innovator's dilemma. You see legacy industry incumbents who don't see this as a threat. They think it's silly or irrelevant to their business model or something separate. And I think they're becoming surprised, and they'll be increasingly surprised by it. From a policy standpoint, there's similar hard questions, like that copyright question. If you're running YouTube and a user, and you have millions of users, one uploads a video that is a copyrighted music video, for example. Under the previous legal regime before the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, you could have been held fully liable for all the damages incurred by violating that person's copyright because of your user's actions. And you have millions of users. So take, I don't know, it could be $2 million statutory damages for that one violation, multiply it by your millions of users. You can't run YouTube in that world. That liability regime, which was reasonably calibrated for a world before user-generated content platforms like YouTube and Facebook and things like that, just didn't make sense in the new world of the internet, where people wanted to build websites that would just be meeting places and users would provide the content. And users should be liable for copyright infringement, if you believe in copyright, which is a bigger conversation. But should this open platform be liable for all the actions of their users? I hope not, because if it is, it won't exist. So we had to have this compromise with respect to how we create liability for intermediaries, and it was the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which said, the notice and comment safe harbor said, or notice and takedown safe harbor said, look, if you see somebody violating your copyright, file a claim with the intermediary. They'll have a certain period of time to respond and then take it down if they feel like your claim is justified. And if you follow those processes, you, the intermediary, you're not going to be liable for all the damages that you could incur by violating copyright. It makes it possible to operate these websites, both big websites like Facebook and YouTube, but as I said, also a blog. So take that and look at Bitcoin. Bitcoin works because it's a peer-to-peer network where people all over the world run full nodes, they run mining nodes, and they relay transaction messages on the peer-to-peer network. And if they're mining, they perform the proof of work and create new blocks and validate the transactions and create the canonical ledger of all Bitcoin transactions. Those people are doing that. They're doing that because they're self-interested, especially the miners, not really the full node, just non-mining full node operators. But they do it in order to create a public good, an open platform, just like Facebook or Google were in many ways an open platform for content. The Bitcoin blockchain is an even more open, because it's not owned by one corporation, platform for data in the blockchain, which is usually just Bitcoin transactions. But that's nothing to scoff at, because that's like digital gold potentially, and a way to move money across borders without relying on anybody, which is amazing. So a liability regime that could crush that, just like there were liability regimes with copyright that could crush Facebook and Google. What is it? Well, it's money transmission licensing law. In the US, for example, we have state regulations. So every state except Montana, oddly enough, big sky, every state except Montana has money transmission licensing laws that say if you're a money transmitter, you can't do that with customers in our state unless you first come before us and get a license. Now, their definition of money transmitters are so broad in several states, and they're different in each state because this is state law, not federal law, that in several states, a miner or someone running a full node, and God help you if you start talking about multi-sig wallets and holding 1 out of 3 keys or something like that, you might be a money transmitter if you're doing those things, which is silly because the ill that money transmission regulation was meant to address is, shady companies losing your money. And a miner, or someone, especially just someone running a full node, can't lose your Bitcoin. That's the whole point. They're part of a peer-to-peer network where you trust the system as a whole and the consensus mechanism. You don't trust any one party. So licensing those persons, aside from making it non-viable to run that, to do that activity, and therefore non-viable to build part of the Bitcoin peer-to-peer network in the US at least, unless you were willing to break the law, also wouldn't address the kind of harms that those laws are supposed to address. So it's just a bad fit. And it's sort of like in the internet context, nobody wants there to be this liability regime that would make it impossible for YouTube to operate. Nobody in the state governments wants there to be a liability regime to make it impossible for people to run Bitcoin nodes. But there was this existing law that, if interpreted the wrong way, would crush this thing. And so that's why that was one of our first efforts at Coin Center, was to work with the Uniform Law Commission, which is just this body that creates model laws for the states to then pass in legislation, and to work with the states themselves to develop, either come up with better interpretation of the existing money transmission licensing law to make it clear that you're not going to be liable for running a full node or holding keys in a multisig if you can't transact, or, if not reinterpreting state law, creating new state law. And the Uniform Law Commission created this model act that states are now contemplating passing into law that would create the same result. So
is it still not actually clear who is a money transmitter then?
No, it's not.
Right.
Not really.
But it wouldn't make sense to pursue miners, for example, but it does probably make sense to look at Shapeshift.
So, okay, a bunch of things there. It does not make sense to pursue miners, and we haven't seen states pursuing miners, but that's not good enough, I think. We have the rule of law in this country, and there shouldn't be this sword hanging over your head that even if it never falls, it just shouldn't be there. So the fact that you could interpret these laws to cover things like mining is a real problem, even though we haven't seen states try to do that. Now, companies like Shapeshift, or companies like Coinbase, or companies like Circle, we think at Coin Center that the heart of the matter generally should be, if you hold custody of consumer funds, then you're in that position of trust. You could get hacked. You could have bad internal controls. You could have corrupt people working for you. Or your systems could just fail massively, and you'd lose people's money. And that's the ill that state money transmission licensing was meant to address, because Western Union can lose your money. So if you're doing something that puts you in that position of trust, then it makes sense to treat you just like any other financial institution that's in a position of trust. Now, you might then ask me, okay, Peter, should these companies get money transmission licenses? That's another conversation, though. I think the first thing we want to advocate for, just as a reasonable, policy organization, is parity with existing financial institutions. So in some states where they're going to license these organizations that are in a position of trust, then cryptocurrency companies should as well. But then the second thing we should think about, aside from just parity, is can we make this better? And not just better for cryptocurrency companies, just better. It's silly that PayPal and Venmo have to get licenses in 53 states. Because they have customers all over the world. There should just be one U.S. regulator at the very most, because they have regulators all over the world in other countries as well. So the next conversation is, okay, can we get away from this process where you're going to have to go state by state and explain your business, which is especially hard if it's a Bitcoin business, because you're running into a state regulator who doesn't know what Bitcoin is, and you have to explain that and why you're different than Western Union, who's the normal company they regulate. So you'll have to go 53 states, explain your business, get licensed in all of them where you expect to have customers. You get examined by 53 different authorities, which you welcome into your business to look through your books. Some of them do now cooperate on joint examinations, but it's a small fraction of the total. So what could we have that's better there? Well, we could have a federal money transmission regulator, and maybe it would be within Treasury, or maybe if it was cryptocurrency focused and also had, concerns about market manipulation, it could be at the CFTC or something like that. And we've written reports about how we need a federal alternative to the money transmission licensing regime because it's simply so complicated.
How does something get elevated from being state regulated to becoming federally regulated?
No.
How do you elevate from one to the other?
You are forgiven for living in a rational country with a much simpler system.
Well, you say that, though. I mean, we've got a problem at the moment with Brexit where we're trying to have...
You used to be a rational country.
We're trying to have a part of our country which is Northern Ireland now, which doesn't want to have a hard border with the customs union, yet is trying to have the same rules as the UK. So we're starting to invent problems.
You're starting to invent problems.
But yeah, so how does something get elevated from being state regulated to federally regulated. God, I can't. It's a tongue twister.
So it's an act of Congress.
Right.
The Constitution, which is the highest law of the land, has a supremacy clause in it, which says that it sort of is an order of operations for government. At the lowest level is the county law. Then if the states pass a law over the county law is null if it preempts. The term is preemption. And then if the federal government passes a law that somehow conflicts or explicitly overrules a state law, then the federal law preempts the state law. And then there are some limitations on that. Like Congress isn't supposed to do things that are very local. They're supposed to regulate national things like interstate commerce. And if they're going kind of like outside of their lane and doing something very local, you could bring a challenge and say this isn't permissible powers of Congress. But if it's interstate commerce, it definitely is the permissible powers of Congress. And I can't think of many things that are more interstate commerce than Bitcoin or money transmission broadly, including PayPal and Venmo. It's literally money crossing state lines. So there would definitely be authority. The problem is, I made it sound easy. Oh, you just have the federal government preempt the state governments. But you need an act of Congress to do that. And Congress, for all its virtues and faults, it doesn't do very much these days because there's so much partisan gridlock, and state preemption also tends to be a hot button issue politically because a lot of people are elected as representatives from their states, and they have to make nice with local politicians. And if you're sort of stomping on your own local politicians, it could be hard back in your home district. So these things become difficult very fast, and we can talk about how good a system would be. And I think a lot of people agree that it makes total sense, but getting that law passed is very hard. We're working on it, though.
Are there any additional complexities as to where the Bitcoin is? So, for example, if I was in New York and I sent Bitcoin to you and you're in Washington, but is strictly speaking the Bitcoin even in New York or Washington, and it's distributed on computers around the world? So really, have I sent it to 20,000 nodes around the world? Does that become a additional level of complexity, or is that ignored?
It's certainly a level of complexity when you're explaining these things to regulators, because right. I think often their first question is, okay, where is it at this moment in transit? And at that point, if I want to give them a real understanding of Bitcoin, I say, okay, hold on, we got to go back. First, there are no Bitcoins. There just aren't. They don't exist. There are ledger entries in a ledger that's shared computers, 10,000 or so computers across the country and the world. And so they don't exist in any physical location. The ledger exists in every physical location, essentially. And so geography doesn't make sense here and is not going to help you figure out your policy here. What you want to focus on are the harms to people in your state and the persons doing those harms. And so you want to think about the geography of the person selling a service to customers in your state, which would be a company like Coinbase potentially, or Zappa or whatever, and then the people in your state. And don't start thinking about bigger issues of geography, because you won't achieve any useful policy outcomes, either protecting consumers, and you'll just make innovation difficult because no one will know what the heck you're talking about.
Right.
It comes up actually more specifically, and this is a little interesting, in the federal definition of money service business. And I know you said you would like to keep this podcast sort of more entry level, so I've
let's just go with it.
Okay. So there's state money transmission licensing, and that's for consumer protection. You got to get a license in all the states where you have customers if you're holding their Bitcoins for them. Maybe. Complicated. Then there's federal money services business regulation for anti-money laundering purposes. So not solvency and making sure you don't lose people's money, but making sure you know your customer and you're watching out for people laundering money through your service. So the federal definition of money services business for anti-money laundering policy is slightly different than the state definitions for money transmission, again, because these are different regulatory bodies and they created their laws at different times. And it says money transmission, which is a subcategory of money services business, shall be accepting and transmitting currency or currency substitutes, so therefore Bitcoin probably, right? Mm-hmm. How could you argue it's not? From one person to another or from one location to another. And the purpose of that, and that predates Bitcoin, of course. That's old bank secrecy stuff from the 70s and the implementing regulations that happened in the 80s and 90s. The purpose of that was, what if you have a U.S. person with a U.S. bank account who transfers their own money to a Swiss bank account from one location to another, but same person to a person. And that was the purpose of that. But it makes things rather confounding or interesting in the context of cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, because we know when people send Bitcoin from one person to another, at least we can know quite easily. But what does it mean when one sends Bitcoin from one location to another? And I think the only sensible way to interpret it is when you're sending it from one institution that's holding your Bitcoin to another institution that's holding your Bitcoin, not necessarily anything else, because no other interpretation really makes sense. But this comes up, interestingly, in the context of ICOs. And I'm sort of diving even further into crazy territory here. But there's this open question whether an ICO is itself a money services business. You wouldn't think so. And I think a reasonable interpretation is that they're not. Say what you will about ICOs. I think a lot of them are fraud and whatever. But at the end of the day, the genuine ones are somebody made something and they're selling it to people. They're not an intermediary in a money transmission sense. They're not taking from Alice and giving to Bob. They are Alice, who invented, X coin, and selling it to Bob, who probably shouldn't buy it, but, whatever, Bob wants to buy it. So are they a money transmitter? Do they accept and transmit money from one person to another? No. They're just selling something to another person. But I think there are folks at FinCEN, which is the regulatory authority for anti-money laundering, and lawyers in the space looking at the ICO question from a money services business standpoint who would say, no, they accept money from Bob in one location, i.e. the Bitcoin or Ether they take in the ICO sale, or maybe even the dollars, and then they transmit it to another location, which is the new blockchain that they created when they launched their coin.
Right.
That's weird.
Yeah.
But that is one location to another. And so that's how maybe you could squeeze an ICO promoter into the bundle of money services businesses. And that's completely separate, by the way, from securities law, which they might also be transgressing if they're actually, offering an investment contract. At which point, the SEC would be the anti-money laundering authority on point, as well as the investor protection authority on point, and not FinCEN. So it gets really complicated. Don't do ICOs.
Yeah, well,
that's the takeaway.
So an interesting, therefore, question for you is: have ICOs massively complicated your work, and have they become a distraction? And also, how do you prioritize what to work on?
That's an awesome question, because you actually you nailed our internal conversations over the last 2-3 years now. So they're not a distraction because they are a real subject of real regulations that could also bleed into the things that we care most about, which is preserving the freedom to innovate using open blockchain technology. And a pre-sold token where you have, some kind of Google spreadsheet keeping track of who you owe tokens to once you build your network and who's paid you Bitcoin is not open blockchain technology. But what you end up using the money you raise to build, if you're genuine, might be, if we think about the specifications for all the file storage networks, Storage, SIA, Filecoin, if those things work, they're great. They decentralize storage, which is still this choke point in internet architecture. Amazon runs almost every website in the world now, which is kind of alarming. And that would be great. And that's the kind of thing we'd love to see open blockchain technology do. We're not just in it for Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin is fundamentally important because it's the first open blockchain network and it does something real. It allows people to send money and pay and store value potentially. But we'd also like to see open blockchain networks used for these other things. So the ideas behind a lot of the ICO boom, to me, were compelling. It's this pre-funding aspect that I think is not within Coin Center's wheelhouse to sort of defend, because we were never out to revolutionize capital formation. That's not Coin Center's mission. Coin Center's mission is to preserve the freedom to innovate using open blockchain technology, not revolutionize how companies raise money to build things. So to that extent, it is a bit of a distraction. However, it's linked, and the definition of a security, at least in the US, is a flexible standard because the statute, the 33 Act, it has this undefined term called investment contract within the definition of a security. So you're left thinking, okay, well, what is an investment contract? That sounds like a lot of things. And the courts created a standard for determining when something's an investment contract, and it's called the Howey test. It comes from a case in the late 1940s, early 1950s that dealt with orange groves, which we won't talk about. But the test says, okay, something's an investment contract when there's an investment of money in a common enterprise with an expectation of profits reliant on the efforts of a third-party promoter. And so, sure, that sentence, I think you could make a case that applies to a lot of these pre-funding activities. Here, give me your money, I'll build future coin, it'll be better than Bitcoin, and then I'll give you future coin. Investment of money, expectation of profits, reliant on the efforts of this person who's promising future coin. Pretty clear-cut case there. But what about Bitcoin? I mean, people invest their money in Bitcoin, and let's just leave out exactly who they bought it from or how, usually expecting profits. It's just true. And it's sort of an unfortunate reality of how these systems all have to begin. If you're creating money from scratch, there's going to be opportunities to make money. And a lot of people are going to want to get rich, and they're going to see their friends getting rich, and they're going to get FOMO, and they're going to make bad decisions. With an expectation of profits, reliant on the efforts of a third-party promoter? I don't know. I mean, I don't think Bitcoin fits that test, primarily because there is no discernible third-party promoter upon whom Bitcoin users really do rely upon. Not in the sense that you rely upon Steve Jobs to make, or you did rely upon Steve Jobs to make Apple profitable, or Tim Cook today. Sure, there are people that play roles in the Bitcoin ecosystem that create value and lead to the price going up, or maybe they fail to create value and the price goes down. But none of them are as central as the sort of corporate management structure of a normal security or a normal investment.
I think the difference being, though, that most ICOs kind of look like a company or are a company.
That's right. And especially in that pre-funding stage.
Yeah.
Because at that point, in the pre-funding stage, there's no open source software, or there's a little, but it's incomplete, doesn't work the way it's really intended to work yet. So there might be a GitHub repository, but it's not functioning. And there's no blockchain that's running, generally speaking. So there isn't a peer-to-peer network. There aren't people staking or mining or doing whatever they're supposed to do on the open consensus protocol participating. And so you don't have all the people out there who are or could be a stakeholder or a miner or whatever to power the decentralized infrastructure. You just have the person promising to eventually have that happen. And you don't have necessarily a wide base of people developing the software. You probably just have one or two. It might even be proprietary, or it might just be a white paper and not even developed yet. In which case, you've got obvious reliance on a third-party promoter. But as I said, with Bitcoin, it's still kind of tricky. Like, BitPay used to sponsor, and God bless them, it was great. The Bitcoin Bowl, like the college football. With the Bitcoin sponsor. And this was part of a way to get more people to understand Bitcoin and like Bitcoin and see the real value in the system and yes, ultimately make the price go up. So were people relying on them? No more than you would rely on one particular subsection of the gold industry, like dentists who make gold fillings for teeth, or scientific uses where they use it in industrial applications, or miners who are actually digging out of the earth. No more than you rely on any one of those for the price of gold. Oh, and Peter Schiff. Peter Schiff also relying on for the price of gold because he sells shiny rocks. So are any of them promoters of gold as a security? No, that's nonsense. Everyone knows that's nonsense. But the bottom line is Bitcoin, miraculously, is kind of similar. There's that many people out there in the world doing different things with Bitcoin, and all their cumulative actions together do impact the price, but no one is ever reliant on any one. And that's a long-winded way of saying that it is really decentralized. And so one of the things that's been really rewarding for us at Coin Center is being on the sort of vanguard of working on these legal issues. So back in 2015, we were writing about securities law. It was mostly before the ICO boom. Ether, I think, was having its pre-sale or was about to have its pre-sale. And we started saying, look, people are going to ask questions. People are going to say, does Bitcoin fit this test? Does Ethereum fit this test? Does anything fit this test? And we started writing about it, said, look, you want to look for two things. Is the network functional? Because then the creator maybe could step away and it would be okay? And is it decentralized? Because then the creator's really, truly irrelevant. And that was sort of a rubric we developed, and it's come to, I think, be very valuable to both policymakers in the space and hopefully to some people who were thinking about doing ICOs, but maybe didn't because they read a little bit of our materials, which would be great if that's didn't make a huge dent if that's the case, because God knows we had a huge ICO boom. But
it's therefore a strange position for you because there's so much benefit to Bitcoin. There's so much work that you guys can do to promote it, to advocate for it, to support regulators. But because you're supporting open blockchains, you're also therefore supporting Ethereum. And I think we probably, almost everyone now is realizing the whole ICO boom is probably net bad. It could get regulated to the point where maybe next year we'll start to see regulated ICOs that have some kind of benefit that are quite good. But I feel like potentially it's taken some time and effort away from the good work you could have been doing for, say, Bitcoin.
So Coin Center is pretty aggressively coin agnostic. I'm still personally most interested in Bitcoin because it's conservative. I like Ethereum, though, because I like the sort of dynamism that seems to be occurring on top of that platform. And yeah, part of that dynamism is people doing their ERC20 token sales. And that has regulatory consequences, and that has reputational consequences for everything. But you can't just be driven by your fear of negative reputational consequences. Because if you were, you'd stay the hell away from Bitcoin as well. I mean, a system that can move millions of dollars across borders is going to have some uses that are very unsavory. It's also going to, I think, make the world freer, better, and be a buttress for human dignity and prosperity. But it's going to have some unsavory use cases. So I wouldn't presume to be smart enough to call it at this point and say, it's going to be Bitcoin, we should focus 100% on Bitcoin. And also, the way policy works, unless you're really unscrupulous, which your listeners will have to take my word for it that I'm not really unscrupulous. But unless you're really unscrupulous as a lobbyist, you're usually trying to work for policy that just sets general rules that apply to everything in a sort of equal way. So we're not going to go to Capitol Hill and say, we need the Bitcoin Promotion Act of 2019, where the Bitcoin cryptocurrency will somehow be given preferential regulatory treatment compared to other cryptocurrencies. We're going to argue for neutral legislation that allows Bitcoin to flourish. And if somebody creates a new Bitcoin, and maybe they don't pre-sell it, maybe they just do what Satoshi did, which I think is actually the right thing to do, and they just, do the work uncompensated, release the software, release the open consensus protocol, and if people want it and it's useful, it'll run. And maybe it's not Bitcoin, and maybe it's something new.
A bit like Grin's doing. Have you followed Grin?
That's right. Grin is doing this. And so our work in securities law is still relevant there because if Bitcoin might be a security, even without the pre-sale, under a loose interpretation of the Howey test, then so could all these other things. And especially the new ones, frankly, because people are looking at them more askance because they're new. The silly interpretation of securities laws that I've often heard is that, well, Bitcoin slipped under the radar because it was so early. And Ethereum slipped under the radar because it was so early. And there's some truth to those statements. Like, yes, people were not paying attention back then. But the statute of limitations on these things is long. And we should want good rules. And a good rule that Coin Center advocates for is if you build something that really is decentralized and functional, then what it is today, once it's decentralized and functional, is not a security. Now, you might have, this is one thing that's difficult to communicate. You might have raised money in order to build that thing that is today decentralized and operational. And maybe the way you raised money was improper. Maybe that was actually unregistered securities issuance. But that is a separate inquiry from what you ultimately built and should be a separate inquiry. And as I said, we're not out there to defend people who are raising money improperly, But we are out to defend the things that people built, whether they raised the money properly or not, if they become properly decentralized and functional, because then they become part of this architecture that could make the world a much better place. And I'm not willing to take bets on which project is going to be the foundation of that architecture yet. I mean, I think it's likely Bitcoin, but I'm not going to hedge my policy prescriptions and what I recommend based on one or the other.
Next up, I talked to Peter more about working with policymakers and about financial privacy. But before that, I have a message from my show sponsors. Okay, so let's talk about Deribit again, the platform for Bitcoin traders. As I mentioned, I'm really excited to be working with them, especially with all the things they've been doing, all the great things I've heard about them from my trader buddies. So why have people been moving to their platform? Well, they've never been hacked. The platform is built for stability, so they have no system overload crashes when the markets go a bit crazy. They can also support high-frequency trading. They have instant withdrawals, and they have never once had a socialized loss. Right now, they are a Bitcoin-only futures platform offering up to 100x leverage for you crazy leverage traders, perpetual contracts with up to 100% leverage too, and they have the only liquid Bitcoin options market in the world. So go and check them out. Let me know what you think. If you want a discount, you can get a 10% discount by heading over to deribits.com, which is deribits.com. Don't forget to use the S if you want the discount. Please note that Deribit is not available to US citizens. So let's talk about BlockFi again. Need to make a payment, but you don't want to sell off your crypto? BlockFi can help. BlockFi is the leading crypto to USD lender in the US, servicing over 45 states. Use your crypto to do things like buy a car, pay off your credit cards, or even pay your taxes. There is no need to buy tokens or pay a membership fee to get started. Visit blockfi.com/whatbitcoindid to learn more about using your crypto without selling it. And they have a special offer for you if you head over there. Yes, if you head over to blockfi.com/whatbitcoindid, you can get $25 in free crypto added to customer collateral loans under $10,000 and $50 in free crypto added to customer collateral loans over $10,000. And applying takes less than 2 minutes. And I guess it's you probably need to be impartial anyway in that and allow currency competition within crypto.
You don't need to. If you believe in markets and freedom, you should.
Yeah. So let's talk about regulations and working with the regulatory bodies. So which bodies do you work with primarily, and how does the relationship work? Are you reaching out to them? Are they reaching out to you? Is it just some kind of symbiotic relationship? How does this actually work?
Symbiosis is pretty accurate, I suppose. When we first started, we were new, but there was already a lot of demand for this work. Bitcoin Foundation was struggling a little and doing less and less, and so there was a bit of a vacuum as far as who can we bring in to explain this. So if you're a member of Congress and someone in your district has told you about Bitcoin, maybe for bad reasons, maybe because they got ransomwared or something like that, and they demanded payment in Bitcoin, you want answers. Who are you going to call? It's not Ghostbusters. It shouldn't be Coinbase or Zappo unless the questions are specific to custodial cryptocurrency exchanges. But if you just want to learn about Bitcoin, you should be learning about it, we think, from a nonprofit that is focused on the technology. And that's what Coin Center first set out to do. And most of our work was just education. And so it's in those educational briefings, whether it's one-on-one with a staff member of a congressman or one-to-many, maybe at an agency, that you make the connections, and they come to see you, I think fairly in our case, as an honest broker of information that will help them do their job better, but also won't make it too easy for them. These are hard questions. How can we promote innovation but still protect investors? How can we promote financial privacy but still have some level of anti-money laundering controls in place? But so we I think became sought out in DC and also in a lot of the state governments that were grappling with the money transmission question because we had good information. We were always also able to connect people with folks in the industry who were actually building this stuff, whether they're core developers or whether they're people like Coinbase or the other companies and things like that. And you asked also more specifically, I didn't mean to dodge the question, which agencies. It's really all of them that touch Bitcoin, which alarmingly, and again, you have a more rational system where you're coming from, is a lot of agencies. So in the UK, you have the FCA, which does most of the regulation of financial institutions. In the US here, you have the SEC for investor protection purposes, where things are securities. So there's that difficult question whether any of these things or all of these things are securities. You have the CFTC, which regulates derivatives that are traded where the underlying thing under the derivative is a commodity, and most things are commodities, including Bitcoin. You have FinCEN, which is a division or a bureau of Treasury, which means they have an independent budget within Treasury that focuses on financial surveillance and anti-money laundering. So that's the money services stuff I was talking about earlier. And you have the CFPB, which is a newer consumer protection federal regulator that looks at like unfair and deceptive acts and practices of lenders and financial institutions. You have 3 banking regulators, the OCC, which is not entirely relevant here because banks aren't holding Bitcoin, but would be relevant if they offered a fintech charter, which would be a way to become a licensed financial institution and maybe do like running a Bitcoin exchange or things that are not traditional bank activities, but close enough. That's the fintech charter that they're contemplating offering that basically to companies. So we worked with the OCC. The other 2 banking regulators are the Fed and the FDIC. The Fed is sort of, okay, well, you don't need a full breakdown of all banking law. And then you have all the state regulators as well. So you have state money transmission regulators who tend to be the Department of Financial Institution with any given state. So they also regulate the state chartered banks. And they also do the unfair and deceptive acts and practices thing that the CFPB does. And that's just the U.S. And CoinCenter's vision longer term is to work towards good global policy. But as you can see, we've got an alphabet soup and a lot of work to do here just in the U.S. So we've worked with all of these agencies.
But it does feel like the U.S. agencies, they have a global reach. If they're not happy with something a crypto company or firm is doing internationally, they can reach out to them. So it always feels like follow the US regulations first and the rest of the world will maybe kind of follow.
That's right. Yeah. The extraterritorial reach of US regulators is very real. So if you think that you're building something that would be illegal in the US and your activities would be illegal in the US and it's okay, I'll just locate over here, you better be sure they don't have extradition with the U.S., which is a pretty small number of nations across the world. And yeah, U.S. policy tends to end up reflected globally. So like our anti-money laundering policy, for example, FinCEN was one of the early regulators globally to come out and say, look, if you're accepting and transmitting currency or currency substitutes, including virtual currency, including Bitcoin, you need to do suspicious activity reporting and know your customer and all that. And we're only now seeing Europe catch up with that. And I'm not offering an opinion as to whether those are good policies or not, but they're policies that definitely do sort of echo and repeat overseas eventually.
One thing I found really interesting is that it's very easy to see why regulators might be scared of crypto and Bitcoin because it's, when someone like Nouriel says it's used by terrorists and criminals, and it is easy to, with certain cryptocurrencies, to move value around anonymously. Yet at the same time, I've been surprised how open and forward-thinking and how well-researched some of the regulators are. So there was obviously your Senate testimony hearing. Mm-hmm. There was one person particularly stood out, Tomlinson. One of the was just, I'll dig it out and put it in the show notes. It seemed to really know what they were talking about.
Yeah.
And also we've got obviously Hester Pierce, Christopher Giancarlo. There's actually, It's been a lot more open-minded and a lot more pro-Bitcoin and crypto than I would have expected. Have you found the same? And is this because of you guys?
I mean, it would be...
you can take the credit.
The world is complex. And when I first started, Jerry and I would talk about like, what's a win? I think the most you ever hope for is to just nudge the conversation slightly in one direction. You can never really take credit for something that broad, like this many people finding it okay. I think a lot of it comes from us and other folks and people who are just smart comparing these things to the internet. And I know that Nouriel Roubini is especially skeptical of that. He says, like, it's not like the internet. But I disagree. I just have to disagree because I can't think of another technology that's been as open to experimentation. You can just build on it without permission as the internet was, other than Bitcoin and, cryptocurrencies. You see this explosion of things happening. And that's to me, all the indicia I need to believe that this is a fundamental piece of technological architecture that will revolutionize life. It might not be Bitcoin, it might be something like Bitcoin, but it's going to change things substantially. And if we capitalize on that and bring those innovators here in the US, that's good for the US. So that message, I think, especially resonates with Congress, because Congress does understand the internet. They saw what happened, and they saw how, members who helped make good policy with respect to the internet were able to hold that up as a trophy. Like, I brought jobs to the US in a time when everyone was worried about jobs going overseas. I'm part of what made Silicon Valley great. I'm part of what made the US the wellspring of the World Wide Web and the internet. No offense to Tim Berners-Lee. But if you can make that case with Bitcoin, then you're already halfway there, because you can also address a lot of concerns that lawmakers and regulators have. They say, well, we see this being used for ransomware. We see this being used for online drug markets. And the answer is yes, of course. Criminals always use good technology. In fact, they usually use them before regular people do, because they're really out for an edge and they don't have the benefit of the law to help them. So they need better tools that don't fail. I thought a fun moment during testimony where I was speaking to a congressman who's a Southern Democrat about NASCAR, about how in the early days of NASCAR, all the tech that was there, like the stock cars and souped up automobiles and all the driving skills, they were earned by bootleggers who were trying to outrun the police. And then they put their ingenuity to better uses eventually. But new tech is always attractive to criminals, and especially open tech that anyone can build on. So the early days of the internet, mostly porn and scams. It's just true. And the early days of crypto, unfortunately, also true. But that doesn't mean that these things are permanently bad in any way. And so I think that message is fairly easy to understand. And it's part of this sort of American spirit of, things are allowed until they're prohibited. And we like chaotic innovation to a certain extent, because ultimately it leads us to have an edge globally. I think Americans often think of themselves as the wellspring of new ideas. We don't perfect them, and we certainly don't have like a perfectly sanitized and ordered culture, probably because of these chaotic new ideas. But we at least create the chaotic new ideas. So I think that resonates with lawmakers. And then with regulators, you were saying you've got a number who are extremely well informed and not necessarily against it. And that's because regulators are sharp. More often than not. And when something might be in their wheelhouse, they will learn fast. And so the number you mentioned, Christopher Giancarlo at the chairman of the CFTC, Hester Pierce, commissioner at the SEC, they know this stuff really well. They understand its importance as something larger than just their agency's purview, and they understand, I think, very well how their agency should deal with the policy issues that the technology raises.
And on a personal level, that's quite a journey to go from creating websites in New York to be sat at the Senate testimony defending crypto and Bitcoin as the champion for everyone. Just a couple of questions on that. Firstly, how much preparation went into that testimony? How nervous were you? And did you have that kind of whoa moment, like, look where I am?
I think the biggest whoa moment I had, look where I am, was the year before when I first testified in front of the House. I actually don't remember. Was it House Financial Services or House Digital Consumer Goods? Or I think it was House Financial Services was the first that I testified in front of. And so that was the first time I testified in front of any chamber of Congress. And that was frightening and cool. My background as an actor, I think, helped, because I'm used to audiences. I'm used to talking in front of lights and things like that. So I wasn't maybe as nervous, but I was nervous. Because the one thing you can get away with as an actor is at least you didn't write the material. You can blame stuff on the playwright. Like, oh, you didn't like the play? Well, yeah, the source material wasn't great, or the director wasn't great. But when you're actually you're a witness, it's both you presenting the thing and you creating the thing. It's sort of more vulnerable, if you will, because it's your ideas and your presentation. How much preparation went into the Senate banking testimony? a lot, and it was a busy time this past summer for a number of reasons. Fortunately, and we say this in a footnote at the beginning of the written testimony, which is quite long. It's an adapted version of our Open Matters paper because they were looking on just like good information about why these technologies are important. And that was a paper that I was really proud of from the year before, where we laid out, this is what open networks are good for. You need open consensus mechanism driven networks like Bitcoin and Ethereum in order to do at least these three things. And it was electronic cash, identity, and improved infrastructure for the Internet of Things.
I rewatched the testimony yesterday and today, and I noticed specifically that you emphasized the point open a number of times, and specifically in your
actually public. We rebranded. We went from open to public. Yeah,
that was it. I've got it written down here. But you specifically said public, and I couldn't tell if that was a message you're trying to land everywhere with everyone, or it was also in response to specifically to one of Nouriel's points about permission blockchains. Like, were you just trying to kind of push that to one side because it's not really relevant to the conversation?
Oh, interesting. So a couple of things. The one moment where Nouriel and I kind of agreed was on the permission blockchain stuff. I'm not as deeply skeptical as he is about permissioned blockchains. I'm just not that interested in them because I do think they have fewer implications for both policy and just generally, the technological landscape, because they're kind of like better database products for financial institutions and whoever. Why did we emphasize public? So we switched from open to public. It's not like a big ruse or anything, just because we think it's easier to communicate the message that we want to get across, which is that this is a neutral platform for people to build things on top of. This is a piece of infrastructure, like a road or like a viaduct or like utilities. This is something that could become the core of a lot of human experience, whether it's moving money or moving certified identity credentials or doing God knows what else people will do. Just look at what people are building like on top of Ethereum. A lot of it's weird, but whatever. And so if it's going to be this core infrastructure, it should be public infrastructure. It shouldn't be something that Facebook made and sees every corner of. And nothing against Facebook, and I feel bad for them. They've been getting a lot of heat lately, not to mention in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. But I think if you really are thinking about longer term how the technical architecture of human interaction on the internet should be built, it shouldn't be built with these massive corporate intermediaries being able to see everything that happens and potentially censor anything that happens on their platform, because that has real and dire consequences for freedom and human dignity. It would be great tools for totalitarian regimes, for example. And I got into this a little bit in the Senate banking testimony because Nouriel likes to talk about how the real innovation in fintech is not blockchain. It's just the consumer payment apps. It's apps. It's WeChat having WePay, and it's Alipay. And I'm sure there is some truth to that, as in there are probably people who find it easier to transact now because of those systems in mainland China. It's also exceedingly alarming that almost every payment in China today is going through WePay because it's not private. Quite clearly, the government has said we can see any transaction we want, and they of course can censor that ledger however they want as well, because it's not a blockchain. It's not even a permissioned blockchain. It's just a closed app. So if all your payments in all your country are going through one massive database that the government can see anything in and potentially remove people from, if they want to systematically, disable them from the financial system, that's a huge liability. So that's why the public infrastructure messaging is important to us. And it's quite genuine. When I say in my testimony, look, we have public communications infrastructure, the internet, that is an amazing thing that happened that I think is very good. It's one of the better things that happened in the last 30 years, amongst a lot of things that are somewhat alarming. And it would be good if we had similar public infrastructure for payments and for other trust essential interactions like identity and things like that.
Right, okay. I also find the work the SEC is doing quite interesting in that they seem to have taken a hands-off approach to begin with, to almost to see what's going to happen and then react, and they are reacting now with Paragon and Ether Delta. But then I wonder, is that because they wanted to see how it would evolve, or is it just because it took them some time to say get their ducks in a row and realize what they're dealing with?
I think it's actually a very good reason that they move cautiously. These legal questions are not easy. Again, I think our framework and our way of parsing which projects are and are not securities is a good one, but it's by no means the only possible way of interpreting the law. And figuring out how you decide to interpret that law is going to have far-reaching consequences. So if you're a prudent regulator and you're presented with a genuinely new question of law and question of how the world is changing in technology, you don't come out guns blazing. You come out with a report. And that's what the SEC did. The first thing they did was offer a report on the DAO. And the report said a lot of things. It said, we think the DAO was probably a security. Here's why. Based on things that we know about the DAO and how we feel about things right now, we're not going to bring an enforcement action, and put people on notice. And I think they wanted to see how the ecosystem responded to that. And then we saw what I think are the reasonable progression of enforcement actions from there. The early enforcement actions were just naked scams. It was like a real estate-backed coin, diamond-backed coin kind of thing. Then there were pre-sales of utility, quote-unquote utility tokens that you were just relying on the promoters to build this thing in the future, like Munchie. And then eventually they came to exchanges like Ether Delta. The only thing that's interesting to me, and I don't have an opinion about what this means yet because it's still fairly new, is it's interesting to me that they went after a decentralized exchange before going after any centralized exchange. Because there's certainly complicating questions of law and fact if it's a decentralized exchange versus a centralized exchange. But yeah, I don't have an opinion on that. It's interesting.
Just back to your Senate testimony with Nouriel, because it caused quite a lot of commotion, I think we can say. A lot of flack went Nouriel's way. And one thing I've tried to do myself is try and speak to detractors and try and see the alternative opinion. Mm-hmm. And one of the struggles I get is that whenever somebody has an alternative opinion, they usually get shot down as not being knowledgeable enough. So who do you think would have made a good person to debate against?
Interesting. I mean, the format was also strange. I think the Senate Banking Committee wanted kind of a debate, but we don't talk to each other.
No.
It's congressmen talking to us. So it shouldn't have been a debate. It should have been, skeptical viewpoint, more optimistic viewpoint.
Because a better articulated detractor with
maybe one who
fact.
Maybe one who wouldn't put the shit in the written testimony. Literally the word shit.
Yeah.
Who would have been Angela Walsh has said a lot of things that I think are provocative, and I find myself strongly disagreeing sometimes, but she's very genuine and very smart. And her criticism always focuses on, let's unpack these words like decentralization, and let's unpack these words like trust, and really think about what are the incentives in the system, who are you relying on, how does information travel through the system? Like, people say, well, it's open source software, but okay, do people really rely on the GitHub repository? Do people rely on other things? At the end of the day, I'm generally less concerned about a lot of the things she's concerned about. And so we kind of have interesting, she was at the Georgetown DC FinTech Week, and so was I, and we got into, I should never do this. I was like a fifth panelist from the audience, like shouting. I raised my hand, but I shouldn't have done that. But we had a really fruitful conversation, and I'd love to talk with her more. And, there are other people who are reasonable skeptics or definitely, concerned and asking the right questions. Christopher Brummer at Georgetown, he's a professor there, has raised really interesting questions of what would a good disclosure regime look like for ICOs, like, because he's very concerned. And especially with ICOs, I don't blame him. There's so much fraud in that space. And he says things like, okay, what would we want people to disclose when they promote a project and raise money in an ICO? Like, it's not just audited financial statements like you do when you're issuing a security. We also want to know more about like your team and what are their technical backgrounds and what are you trying to build, because it's going to be more baroque than a security by default because it's this open blockchain token potentially. So those are both, just off the top of my head, people who I think are skeptical and have a lot of valuable things to say.
And then back to regulations, we're currently, what is the kind of almost state of play? And I know this is going to sound like a very wide question and answer as much or as little as you can, but where do you feel you have good clarity? Where do you feel like you need further clarity? And what are the key issues that you are now pushing with regulators?
Mm-hmm. You know, Niraj and I were chatting earlier. People don't like us for this, I think, but I think we have good clarity with the SEC. Again, I think the SEC took a really rational, cautious, and well-reasoned approach to carving out their jurisdiction in this space. They didn't claim the whole field, which to me would have been irrational because some things aren't securities like Bitcoin, but they didn't do that. And they've set out a lot of guidance in speeches and now in more formal documents that outlines their view as to how you separate the wheat from the chaff with respect to tokens that are and are not securities. And it comes down, if you look at Director Hinman's speech from last summer, to what I think is exactly the right question. Is it decentralized and is it functional? Now, is that an easy question to answer? No. But there are some things that can't be reduced to simple questions. And if you tried, you'd ruin law. You just would ruin it. The world is not binary. The world is gray, and we're going to have to make choices, and we need frameworks that contemplate nuance in order to eventually come out to have decisions. So I think U.S. policy in securities regulation of open blockchain systems is the best in the world. What else? Anti-money laundering policy got kind of fleshed out early with respect to custodial exchanges. They are money services businesses. They have to file suspicious activity reports and things like that. There are some ambiguities maybe on the horizon with respect to decentralized exchanges and whether they are money services businesses and therefore need to know their customers and file suspicious activity reports. And that is an ambiguous area and a thorny one.
Like, what are you working on right now? What are the key things that you are pushing?
Yeah, so we're working on this question of decentralized exchanges and anti-money laundering regulation because, to my mind, they're not money services businesses. So again, that definition was accept and transmit currency or currency substitutes from one person to another or one location to another. If you are a DEX, properly constructed, you never accept anything or transmit anything. Your users are doing that P2P through information that you organize, but that's like running Craigslist. That's not like running a bank. So to me, and that's just in the anti-money laundering context, by the way. The SEC is also looking at DEXs because they regulate securities exchanges, and they actually have a broader definition of what is a securities exchange. So, but just on the anti-money laundering side, that's an issue that I think is very interesting. And in general, the emergence of privacy-protecting cryptocurrencies, you mentioned Grin earlier. There's, of course, Monero. There's Zcash. And by the way, I'm an uncompensated board member of the Zcash Foundation. These are new tools that are, I think, critical. We were talking about, whether Bitcoin's the one or not. I think the Bitcoin's biggest weakness is its lack of privacy. Nobody's going to use a global economic system where every time you get paid, the people in the cubicle next to you like pop their head up and say like, "Hey, nice raise. Saw it on the blockchain." We can't have that. And I'm not being mean to Bitcoin, or I'm being unfair to Bitcoin rather, because even the Bitcoin core developers and the community recognize that long term we need to find ways to improve privacy with Bitcoin, confidential transactions, things like that. So this is all coming.
But some Bitcoiners would say it's also its biggest strength. Like someone like Safety and the Moose would say its open nature is its biggest strength, because, for example, if you're banking with Bitcoin or financial institutions are using Bitcoin, you can see their ledger.
Oh, sure, but privacy doesn't mean you lose verification of integrity.
Yeah.
In fact, the goal is to have both, and I mean, this is why I've agreed to be an uncompensated board member of the Zcash Foundation. It's the only like advisory or like other position I've taken aside from Coin Center, is because that foundation was constructed to just decentralize development of Zcash. And from what I'd learned about Zcash, I liked it. Primarily because of how Zuko and others would talk about the selective disclosure functionality and the possibility of being able to have a proof, like a really robust mathematical proof that certain things aren't happening. There's no counterfeiting. There's solvency, so you could prove that you have this many Zcash or things like that without leaking all the additional information. Hence the zero knowledge proof. And that tech is not just in Zcash; it's going all over the place. And Monero has another approach using rig signatures and other schemes. And Grin, I need to read more about Grin. It's fascinating. I don't yet understand it, but the idea is you would always be able to prove certain facts about the economy. There are only this many units in circulation. You as an individual would be able to prove certain facts about yourself when you wanted to. Okay, I want to be a nonprofit that accepts donations, so I'm going to make, by sharing a view key or something like that, all of my transactions where I'm receiving money public. Or if you are, I don't know, at an adult bookstore, you should be able to make a transaction that is not public by default.
But do the government regulators really and truly understand privacy coins?
They understand cash. And that's actually really valuable that they understand cash. The regulated financial institution has used a completely anonymous bearer instrument to move money around the world for the last 2-3 centuries. The 1600s is when like notes really started circulating.
Because I would have thought something like Monero would be very scary for regulators.
Right. You'd think.
Yeah.
But cash. Okay, so it's cash and it's digital. So maybe scarier. But when we've talked to a lot of people, honestly, both in law enforcement and in anti-terrorism and things like that, they see it as just another vector. There are so many vectors. There are so many ways to move money to finance your horrible thing. And the biggest one by far is still the regulated financial system and shell corporations and shell accounts at big banks. And prepaid cards are another, and pallets full of cash are another. And so this is new, yeah. Is it really a fundamental change? Not yet. Will it be? Maybe, but it might just be another vector, and we'll see. Again, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. If we don't want to move to a fully transparent financial system like China's moving towards, because that has incredibly dangerous consequences from a human rights standpoint, where somebody could just be, they wake up one morning and because they said something against Xi Jinping, they can no longer transact. None of their cards work. They can't even, I don't know, Internet of Things connected future. They can't even turn on their car. Who knows? And so we need systems that are less transparent than that, less transparent than Bitcoin, and still have integrity. And to me, the only systems that are like that are systems like Monero and Zcash and maybe Grin when it launches, and we'll see.
Right. So therefore, Coin Center's work isn't just about defending technology and innovation, but it's also defending kind of freedom and advocating the positives that come from decentralizing power. I
think that's right. Yeah. I mean, that's why we got passionate about this stuff to begin with. Yeah.
And are enough people aware of what you're doing?
I mean, regulators are, which is good. We get a lot of inquiries, almost more than we can handle now. And the community, we've gotten a lot of great support from the community, and especially recently from certain companies in the space and things like that. Like Kraken gave an incredibly generous donation this past year, and they matched donations from others.
Jesse Powell was my last interview.
Oh, yeah.
Great guy.
He's amazing,
Yeah.
and he said such nice things about us, too. And so
he's also my largest Patreon contributor.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's how we got in touch.
I feel like he's really interested in creating public good for these networks, which is excellent. So that's great. The dark side of that coin, not the Kraken donation, just the dark side of the community. When you're the one who's working with government policy, I think a lot of people identify you as being sort of like a brown coat, a fascist yourself or something like that. So we get a lot of hate too.
I've seen that.
And we get a lot of indifference. People say like, oh, well, you should be, if you don't ship code, you aren't helping Bitcoin. And I think that's very naive. The code is the most important part in a fundamental way, but the world is wet, not just hardware. It's a lot of wetware and hard decisions. And yeah, and I think a lot of this is inevitable, this technology. I think a lot of it is a question of time horizons. Like governments, especially totalitarian governments like perhaps China's, could do a lot to stop this stuff. They wouldn't succeed ultimately, I think, because I'm an optimist about that, but they could delay it and make for horrible pain and suffering in the medium term. So even if you're some sort of crypto anarchist and you think this stuff is inevitable, I think you should still appreciate the work Coin Center does trying to just maintain peace in the decades to come.
And how can people help Coin Center? Like, what do
So-
you want from people?
We're a nonprofit that relies on donations from our supporters, and so we were talking about Jesse Powell's very generous donation. We also get half of our donations from just individuals, some of them small dollar amounts or small Bitcoin amounts, some of them larger. So that's how we survive. We're a 501c4. It's not tax deductible when you give to us, but we don't pay taxes, and we rely on those donations.
So, and this has been a great interview, by the way. We've covered some very interesting things, and I think I'd like to come back and really get into some other areas with you at some point. But just to close out, how do you see the next few years playing out? What's going to be really important for you, for Coin Center, for cryptocurrency, the wider cryptocurrency community and regulations? What's going to be really important?
I think the most important thing is the financial privacy question that we were getting into earlier, because it's hard. It's easy to. I doubt myself sometimes, even in the consumer protection context. When a company fails because of a lack of regulation, what's the worst case scenario? A bunch of people lose their money. When anti-money laundering regulations fail, or more specifically, counterterrorism regulations fail, the consequences are not, it's terrible when people lose money, but in many ways that's a Gaussian or a linear distribution. The sort of black swan event of somebody using these things to finance terrorism or something like that frightens the hell out of me. Now that said, I don't think there's any ability to put these technologies back in the box anyway. And I think on net they'll do much good in the world that will outweigh any bad. But how you develop a balance to protect human dignity and privacy and allow people to transact privately, but still allow law enforcement to get the information they need to stop heinous acts, is a really hard policy question. And people feel very passionate one way or the other. You rarely find people who sit in the middle and say, well, let's try and find a reasonable middle ground. So that getting that right, and I'm working on a long paper on privacy protecting cryptocurrencies right now. Jerry, our executive director, is working on a paper on why privacy is a fundamental good. Getting those questions right and getting the messaging right about them and helping people understand that there's a good way forward here that doesn't involve banning, privacy protecting cryptocurrencies, but also is maybe not a future where everything is unregulated. Finding that middle road there is so hard. It's hard everywhere, but it's really hard there.
Okay, and how can people stay up to date? Who do you want to hear from, and where can they follow you?
Sure. So we love to hear from the community. Our website is coincenter.org. You can reach out to us there. You can see all our work there, and you can see how we use the community as much as we can. Like most of our plain English explainers for topics in this space are written by people who actually built the tech that they're explaining, or maybe a young lawyer who's practicing in the area of a specific legal concern. So if you are building something new, or you're a lawyer that's working on, you think you have a novel way of looking at a legal issue, we're always happy to meet you and talk with you and maybe publish like a backgrounder or something like that.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Peter.
Thanks, Peter.
Okay, what did you make of that? Did you enjoy that as much as I did? God, I think I say that every week, but I do. I enjoy every one of these interviews, and Peter was great. It was really good to talk to him. Actually, I really enjoyed the research process with Coin Center. I enjoy going through all the material they provide on their website, looking through their research. I recommend you check it out. Like I said, there's some links in the show notes. They do so much to work with policymakers to try and keep these systems public and open and free for people to innovate on. And there is some higher purpose there with Peter. You hear it throughout the interview. So that was really cool. I was really glad to get him on the podcast. I hope to get him again sometime in the future. There's so much more I'd love to talk to him about. Try and support them. They do rely on donations. Go and check that out on their website. It's very important that they are able to continue doing their work. I'm not sure how this bear market will affect them, but yeah, please do check them out. Please do consider making a donation. I'm headed up to New York today. I'm going to be there for Thanksgiving. Probably going to be on my own, actually. Seems like everyone's left town for the day. So if anyone wants to come and grab a beer, give me a shout. And if you want to support the show, as you know, there's lots and lots you can do. You can become a patron. Head over to patreon.com/whatbitcoindid. I've got 36 now. It grows every week. It's really, really cool. So thank you for everyone who does that. It really does help me continue to keep the show going, because it's clearly now a full-time job. You can also become a show sponsor. If you're interested in this, please feel to email me on hello@whatbitcoindid.com. Downloads are growing faster and faster. Going to be over 100,000 this month. Who knows what I'll do next month. I've also sold a couple of the ad slots now through to about February, but I do have some space left, so if you're interested, feel free to get in touch. You can leave me a review on iTunes. It only takes 5 minutes. Hopefully you think I deserve 5 stars. And also you can subscribe to the show. Both help with the indexing in the search results on iTunes. You can follow me on social media. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Medium. I'm on Instagram. I'm at whatbitcoindid on everything. And if you reach out to me, I usually reply to anyone. My DMs are always open. You can check out my website, which is www.whatbitcoindid.com. Lots of cool ways you can follow and look through old episodes. And you can sign up to my newsletter. I've got back into the swing of doing that daily. I've got someone giving me a hand. I can't say who it is publicly because he wants to stay anonymous, but he is helping me every day produce that. It's just a digest. We just try and get together the best articles, blogs, tweets, media that's produced every day just about Bitcoin. So if you head over to my website and click on the subscribe button, you can receive that. And lastly, you can share this out with your friends and family. Okay, next show is going to be the anniversary show. It's going to be 1 year since the podcast started, which is pretty amazing. Big thanks to everyone who supported me along the way. It really means a lot. I've really enjoyed doing all these interviews. So anyway, I'll let you go. I hope you have a great week, and I'll speak to you soon.